Privatize the fire department. Privatize the police department. Privatize everything. Make them responsible.
Yes! Go get them! I love it when a Hollywood actor gets something right. Americans just assume government must be in charge of things like road maintenance, garbage collection, ambulance services. British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher raised people's consciousness about that.
The government has a duty to get the best deal for the taxpayer.
Here she's proposing to sell off the government energy company.
The right honourable gentleman takes his customary swipe at private enterprise. He can't stand it. He'd far rather have nationalisation run by politicians who know nothing.
We've got plenty of politicians in America who know nothing but want to run everything, and yet more cities now have woken up to the benefits of an alternative, private management. Len Gilroy of the Reason Foundation publishes the Reason Privatization Report, which tracks what's working and what's not. So what's working?
Well, you have lots of routine services that citizens interact with every day, like their trash service or their water, wastewater, or pothole repair, that kind of thing. You have things that are in the back end of government, things like IT or payroll or those sorts of functions. You have even assets that are run for governments by the private sector.
And how does it work? Why does the private sector do it better or cheaper?
Well, typically they have an incentive to. They want a contract, and they're in a system where they have to compete, and so competition creates that kind of dynamic where you get lower costs and higher quality compared to government, which tends to be a monopoly where there's no competition and tends to be lower quality and higher costs.
And one person who competes with government says everything government buys, they pay above market for and deliver below market service.
Right, and there's just not often very little incentive to be efficient in that kind of system where there's no tension in the system brought by competition. Your
privatization report cites Pontiac, Michigan.
Pontiac is a great story. It's one of those Michigan cities that was financially distressed, went into emergency manager control because of their high debt and their chronic budget deficits. And the emergency manager got to step in and sort of take over decision-making from the politicians. They ended up contracting out to the private sector over 20 different services, including trash collection, public works. They cut their budget in half. They cut their city staffing by 90%, and they cut their debt load by 70%.
They reduced the debt by $87 million. And yet, I mean, private ambulance service, how does that work?
Well, cities and counties across the country contract out their ambulance services to.
But who pays? You're dying, you go in the ambulance, and they hand you a bill?
It's different in different jurisdictions, but in some places taxes cover some of that. So the bottom line is whether it's public or private, poor people in particular are no less served than anyone else by the ambulance service. When 911 says you have to pick someone up, they do.
And they send you a bill afterward?
Right.
And if you don't pay it, maybe Medicaid will pay it.
Insurance, Medicare, Medicaid, other types of subsidies.
In Pennsylvania, they've turned over 500 bridges to a private company?
Right.
To rebuild them for the next 10 years.
Right. They're turning to the private sector in an innovative deal to have the private sector finance and rebuild and maintain over a long period 558 bridges. They're going to do it better, faster, cheaper than government would do in its traditional way of procuring things. And they're going to save about 20% on the cost of delivering and maintaining each bridge.
But maybe it's better. In Chicago, I hear they privatized the parking meters, and people said it was botched.
Chicago was the first to try something experimental in privatizing their parking meters, and they got some things right and they got some things wrong. One of the things that they're criticized for is that they got $1 billion up front from a private company for the right to run their meters for 75 years, and the politicians spent it. So that was, I would say, a fault more of the politicians than the privatization. And notably, other cities and jurisdictions have followed since then to do
in Indianapolis, they privatized the parking meters. They were making $519,000 before privatization, almost $3 million after, because the government meters usually were broken, and it took days or weeks to fix them.
That's right. They would sit on meters that were broken for weeks. The private operator has a 99.98% efficiency rate. They have to keep those things up and running, and they get calls within hours to go and fix meters, and so the utilization is much higher.
So despite these successes, lots of people just hate the idea of turning government services over to for-profit companies.
They want to privatize everything.
They don't want to pay for the things, the roads and the dams and the rivers, the protection of our environment.
It's just stupid. We do want to pay for it. We just want to get our money's worth.
Absolutely. I mean, we pay tax dollars. We want to get good value for money, and that's what you can do through competition and privatization.
Now, one thing people think has to be done by government is airline security. But 2 cities don't use the government for that.
It's actually 20 cities today, but
most of them small.
Right, most of them small, but San Francisco and Kansas City have never gone to a TSA-led screening operation.
And we went to San Francisco and interviewed customers who'd just come through the private screening, and people said, these screeners, they're different.
People here are friendly and willing to help.
I think they're a little more understanding.
Everybody here is friendly, a lot more friendly than Dallas.
Right, Dallas is government screeners. And even though the private screeners were friendlier and quicker, they find more contraband. The TSA tested them. The private screeners found many more illegal items than the government screeners did. Why would that be? Here's a reason. They practice. Here they're racing to match these security cards together under blacklight. The fastest screener will win $2,000. There's even dramatic music. The TSA trains its screeners too, but not like this. In this competition, screeners race to search bags and identify forbidden items. Here's a pipe bomb. Then they rush to repack the bag. All right. The government doesn't do this. The private company knows that if they have a good reputation, they might get richer, get more airports. They have an incentive.
Right, and if they do a bad job and they underperform, then they get fired. And so they have natural built-in incentives versus the TSA, where there is no incentive because they're the monopoly.